Hi, everybody. My name is Anna Marie Luna, and I'm the Acting Director for Protective Services. Just really want to thank all of you for joining us today. We know that many of you have children in the home that you're caring for because there's no school or summer programming right now. So we appreciate you taking the time. Staff, we appreciate you also joining. As you know, this is a hugely important initiative to our agency. We're talking about kinship care or relative placement. So our agency has a strategic plan, and the strategic plan has 4 pillars. And one of our pillars is called more appropriate placements. And under that pillar, we have increased kinship care placements within our agency. And we have been working on this probably for about 1.5 years, and we've made a lot of progress, but we still know that we have a lot of work to do. There's a lot of reasons why our agency is taking this up as one of our initiatives, and we'll talk about all those reasons today, but one of the most important reasons is that it reduces the trauma to our children when we have to remove them from their parents and place them into foster care. So I'm going to ask you all to indulge me in an exercise that I do with our staff. So if you could close your eyes for a minute and you hear a knock on your door. You go to open the door and there's a police officer, law enforcement officer, and he says, I have a warrant here and I need you to come with me. You have 5 minutes to pack a bag. I don't know how long you'll be gone. But I need you to hurry up and get your stuff. So you're panicking, trying to figure out what you're going to take. If it was me, I'm probably crying because this would totally freak me out and I'd be really scared. So you get in the car and you say, where am I going? And he said, I'm taking you to a stranger's house. And you ask again, how long am I going to be there? I don't know. And so he drops you off at this stranger's house. You've never been there. In a different neighborhood. The house looks very different than anything you've been used to. The bedroom that they show you is very different from the bed that you have at your house. The TV shows that they watch are different. The music is different. The food is different. And you're thinking, I have to stay in this stranger's home and I'm really scared and really uncomfortable. I don't know these people. I don't want to do this. And remember, you're an adult, right? And so you have good coping skills. Any unresolved trauma that you've had in your life, you have probably worked on. And it's still a really scary experience. So take a deep breath. I'm going to ask you to close your eyes again. And this time you get another knock on your door. Same officer. Says, I need you to pack your bags. You're leaving your house. I don't know how long you're going to be gone. And you say, well, where am I going? And he says, I'm taking you to your mom's house. Or it could be your aunt, your neighbor, your best friend, your uncle, your grandma. So you pack your bag and you're thinking, okay, well, I don't want to go there. I really like my house. But I'm going to somebody's house that I know. And so you get to that house and you know the house, you know the shows that they watch, you've slept there before. If it was me and I went to my mom's house, I've spent a lot of time there. I know the kind of food she has, I know the shows she watches. And although I'm not thrilled about having to go stay with my mom for an undetermined amount of time, it's a little bit easier for me to take this because I know her. I know that I grew up with her. If it was my aunt, I spent a lot of time with her. If it was my neighbor, I've been there a lot. So I just ask you to think about the differences in that experience for you as an adult. Having to go to a stranger's house versus going to a relative's house. And as I said earlier, you know, we're grown-ups, we're adults, but it still brings some feelings to us because no one wants to leave their house, even though things are great. You know, none of us have perfect lives. We fight with our spouses, you know, we have difficulties with our children, but we like being at home, right? And so having to go somewhere else is hard, but it's less hard if you're going someplace that you know. And so for us, when I talked about that, it's not trauma, it's less traumatizing, it's less traumatizing to our children. We know that that's important for our children because they're going through a lot already. And every day in the United States, and maybe even today in New Mexico, we're removing children and placing them someplace else. And so our goal is that we place them with kin, relative, or fictive kin. Today, you're going to hear a lot of research, just lots of different information that also supports kinship care or relative placement. And what we know is that these children do better with placement stability. They're placed with their siblings a lot of the times. Their well-being outcomes are better, and they achieve permanency more timely, whether that's reunification or guardianship. We know that they spend less time in foster care than children who are not placed with the relative. Additionally, there's lots of emphasis from the federal government related to placing with relative and kin. We have state statute that requires us to find relatives and to provide them with applications within so many days of placement. So there's lots of emphasis, support, pressure from other entities to consider relative and kinship care placement because of all the reasons I've stated. In closing, I want to talk about an African proverb. Many of you probably heard this. It takes a village to raise a child. And what that means is that an entire community of people must interact with children for those children to experience and grow in a safe and healthy environment. The villagers look out for their children. And so when we think about the foster care in the United States, I don't think that the proverb envisioned that a state agency, a government funded agency would be that village. We hope that that village is their relatives, is their community or their neighbors, and that, together we're getting back to the place where a community, a village is stepping up to take care of these children. Now, that is not to say that there is not a need for regular foster parents. I get that a lot. There will always be a need for regular foster parents. What this initiative does for us is it reduces the burden on our system. You all know that we have a shortage of foster parents. We have children in homes where there's too many children. They don't get the attention that they need. This is going to help with that situation. And there will be children who come into care and they don't have relatives. They don't have fictive kin. So there will always be the need for regular foster care. And we have to continue to work towards a system where prioritizing placement with relatives and kin when safe, when available, and when appropriate, that we are taking that on. So I hope you all enjoy this presentation. I've heard it a bunch of times. I love it. I learn something new every time. So with all that being said, I'm going to turn it over to Emily Peeler from the American Bar Association. Emily?
Great. Thank you, Anna Marie. And I'm going to give my colleague Anna a minute to get our PowerPoint up. That should come up on your screen in just a minute. But we're excited to be here with you today. We're going to talk about the value of kinship caregiving and honoring family connections. I'm going to talk a little bit about data and that research that Anna Marie teased for you a little bit. And then we're going to talk deeper about some permanency options around kin and working with kin. And then finally wrap it up with some information about laws in New Mexico and federally and COVID-19 and kinship. So a lot of good things in store for you today, but I want to start by letting you know who we are. So as Anna Marie said, my name is Emily Peeler. I work at the American Bar Association Center on Children and the Law, which is located in Washington, D.C. And Heidi and I do this kinship work all around the country with different states and local jurisdictions. including some work on the national level as well. And the ABA Center on Children and the Law is involved in a lot of things, not just kinship. We've got a lot of attorneys on staff working on things like education and child welfare, immigration, child welfare courts, all sorts of things. Anything you can think of that touches child welfare, we're a great resource for that. And I'm going to let my colleague Heidi just introduce herself real quick.
Good afternoon. Thanks for having me here. My name is Heidi Redlich, Epstein, and as Emily said, we are both work for the American Bar Association Center on Children and the Law. I am the Director of Kinship Policy for the Center on Children and Law, as well as working on several other projects, and very happy to be part of the New Mexico initiative to place with more kin. So thanks.
Great. And Anna, our great partner from Generations United.
Thank you, Emily and Heidi. And thank you to Casey Family Programs and to New Mexico for having us. We partner a lot, Generations United, the American Bar Association, and the Casey Family Programs. And it's a pleasure to work with all my colleagues. And also want to, and especially want to thank those kin resource parents and foster parents and those non-kin resource parents and foster parents that are joining us today. We really honor your work and your commitment to keeping families together. It's very, very important work, probably the most important work. Generations United, I'm with them, and we are a national nonprofit in Washington, D.C., and we do lots of things on behalf of grand families. We've had a national center now for over 20 years. And when we use the term grand families, and I mean all of us on this webinar, when we use that term, we use it interchangeably with kinship families, and both of those terms encompass grandparents, other relatives, close family friends, or what's commonly referred to as victive kin. So kind of fictional kin, fictional family, because they're not related by blood or marriage, but they're like family. So really close friends and godparents and the like. So both those terms, kinship and grand families, encompass all those variety of families, and we really do appreciate you. We do lots of things at the National Center, including federal advocacy, including state level technical assistance, many, many publications and resources, and we're guided by a national network of those with lived experiences, which is vital. So we have a national network of grandparents and other relatives who raise children, and we try to have their voices up front and center. They inspire and have feedback on everything we do. And I'll note that the federal government has said that all state and tribal child welfare agencies should operate this way and should have kinship caregivers, non-kinship caregivers, foster parents, birth parents, foster youth as at the table, and should be part of really moving the child welfare system into the 21st century, and that you should be engaged in meaningful ways. I'm going to turn it back to Emily to ask about you all.
Yes, thank you, Anna. So you all just heard about us, so we want to know who's out there. A poll should have just popped up on your screen asking to identify yourself as either a non-kin resource or foster parent, a kin resource parent or foster parent, CYFD staff, or other. If you are an other, we would love to see what that other is in the chat. And we'll give you about 30 seconds to complete this poll. Okay, it looks like we're at about 80% participation, with about half of you all being CYFD staff, a lot of non-kin resource parent and foster parents, some kin resource parent and foster parents, and just a handful of others I see down there in the chat and advocates. So great, glad to have you all here. So like I mentioned, I'm gonna start this presentation off with the most exciting part, data. So I just want to do this to give you guys an idea of the population we're talking about, and kind of paint the picture for you. And you will notice as I'm going through kinship data that, and throughout the rest of the presentation, that there's really two different types of kinship care. There's the kinship care that happens outside of the foster care system, but then there's also the inside of the foster care system. So those licensed foster parents that are relatives, licensed kin homes, those are inside of the system, but there's also a whole group of people outside of the foster care system that are relatives taking care of children that aren't their own. So if you'll see here on this slide, on the left is national data points. So that big circle right there represents the almost 8 million children who live with a relative who's the head of the household. And then within that 8 million, about 2.7 million children are living with a relative who's the head of the household without a parent living in that household. So that is a big difference, but then we get even smaller, and that very small circle down there is about 140,000 children being raised with relatives inside of the child welfare system. So we start out really big, we get a little smaller, and that's that outside of the system relative caregiving, and then we get inside to the foster care system. So if we look on the right, you can see the numbers for New Mexico. And New Mexico, again, that big circle is children who live with a relative who's the head of the household, and that's about 69,000 kids in New Mexico. Almost 30 of those children are being raised with by kin with no parent in the home, and then about 633 children are in foster care living with kin. So again, there's a lot of people out there living with relatives, either with a parent as the head of the household, and even some living without a parent in that home. So outside of the foster care system versus inside of the foster care system. And on the next slide, we kind of hit that point home a little bit more with, on the left, we know that for every child in foster care living with relatives, there are 19 children outside of the foster care system living with relatives. And in New Mexico, that outside of the foster care system living with relatives is even bigger. With for every one child in foster care with relatives, there are 46 children being raised by grandparents or other relatives outside of the foster care system. And just to give you an idea of who are these relatives that are taking care of these children that aren't their own, there's about 2.4 million grandparents responsible for grandchildren nationally, and 55% of them are in the workforce, so they're still working. 19% of them are living below the poverty line. 25% of them have a disability. 45% of them have provided care for that child for more than five years or more. And 46% of them are over the age of 60. So when we're talking about relatives caring for children that aren't their own, this just kind of paints that picture of who are these people. And I know we've got a lot of you in the audience, so just wanted you to put a face to a name before I give you even more data. So here we start focusing more on the inside of the foster care system. That chart to the left with 3 bars represents children who are in the foster care system living with a licensed relative. The green bars are national numbers. So 32% of children in foster care are living with a licensed relative. In New Mexico in 2018, that was 22%. And then in New Mexico in 2020, we know that there's seen an increase through a lot of these great initiatives that Anne-Marie was talking about earlier. We've seen an increase to almost 30% at 28%. So as we continue to get more data, there will be more orange bars and probably increases in the rest of these charts. This middle chart is about relative adoption. So 35% of children nationally who exit to adoption went to relative adoption. And in New Mexico, that number was 13%. And then kinship guardianship, which is something we'll dive into a little bit deeper with Heidi later on in this presentation. But nationally, 17% of exits from foster care were kinship guardianship. And in New Mexico, that number was 10%. Again, these are 2018 numbers, and we expect through these sorts of initiatives that New Mexico's numbers are going to increase. And when we're talking about kinship guardianship especially, there is a new kinship guardianship law that passed that will certainly see an increase there, especially when we look down to that bottom right-hand corner and know that 50%, almost 50% of those kinship guardianships in New Mexico were subsidized. Again, Heidi's going to talk a lot more about kinship guardianship later in this presentation. So why are kids being placed in kinship families? And this is true inside and outside of the system. And it's also true not just inside the system for kinship families, but also for regular foster families. So we know that people are being placed with kin for reasons such as unemployment, child abuse and neglect, of course, mental health challenges, some of them especially outside of the system, like military deployment or deportation or detainment, are leading to those kinship family placements. And then even when we look inside of the system for substance use, 1/3 of all children placed in foster care because of parental substance use are placed with relatives. And that's a national number, but that's a lot of kids being placed with relatives within that foster care system. So I want to talk next about what Anna Marie kind of teased for us, the value of kinship care. Why do we care about people being connected to kin, being placed with kin? And a lot of these improved outcomes you're seeing on the screen and benefits are true for not just children who are placed with kin, but also are able to maintain those kinship connections. So for instance, cultural identity, of course, is going to be a lot increased when they're placed with family, but also we see an increase with that even if they're just are able to maintain those connections to even fictive kin and blood relatives. We see improved behavioral health and mental health, increased safety, the increased odds of being placed with brothers and sisters if they're with relatives, and an increased sense of belonging. And all of this information comes out of Children Thrive in Grand Families, a fact sheet that's available online that Generations United created, and just really hits home some of the research about placement with kin. So diving into those outcomes just a little bit more, we know that being placed in kinship care has been found to decrease the risk of placement disruption. And of course, we know if children have better placement stability, they're going to have better outcomes as well. Children placed into kinship care also had fewer behavioral problems 3 years after placement than children who were placed into foster care. And then the big one, permanency, right? We want all of these children in foster care to be able to achieve permanency quickly and a good permanency. So children initially placed in kinship care as compared to family foster care were more likely to reunify or exit to guardianship. And we see acknowledgement of these good research findings on the federal level. They just released some new guidance that acknowledged all of this, saying that research demonstrates that placement with kin supports a number of improved outcomes for children, and we must continue to prioritize that. And that's a really great statement and something to keep in mind. This is just a quote from an adult raised by a kinship caregiver to kind of put a face on all of this for you. And he said, "Most people go to grandma's house to get spoiled, but for me, it was the only safe place I had. Getting to live with grandma was like going to grandma's house all the time. I had more love there than anywhere else in my life." And that just really puts some language on those exact research points, that feeling of belonging and stability that comes along with being placed with a relative. And I think also is an example of exactly the exercise Anne Marie had us do, where we're just thinking we're going to be more comfortable in grandma's house than a stranger's house. But of course, not everything is easy with kinship. Just like regular foster care, there are some challenges. Some of the challenges we know kinship families are facing both inside and outside of the child welfare system are establishing a legal relationship. So things like consenting to health care, education, and other services that a child might need. Sometimes that's really, really difficult for a relative who has taken in that child. Children, of course, especially inside the system, but also outside, have a lot of trauma and can have special needs. So a relative dealing with that without the good resources could be a challenge. We also know that relative caregivers face a lot of social isolation and grief due to changing family structures. And I'm sure some of you have experienced that yourself and kind of that unexpected caregiving. And Heidi's going to talk a little bit more about some solutions around these things in a little bit. Another challenge that relatives can face is affordable housing. That's one of those very practical challenges. And finally, limited financial assistance. And so I want to dive a little bit more into that limited financial assistance idea and talk about especially the difference between taking in a child inside versus outside of the system. So you're looking at a chart right now with 3 different columns. The blue column on the left is temporary assistance for needy families, or TANF, child-only grants. So the dollar amount that somebody might receive for having 1 child in their care outside of the child welfare system. In the middle, this orange column is licensed kinship foster care. So if a child is in foster care and they're placed with a licensed foster care relative for 1 child, and you'll see that difference there. Outside of the foster care system is $266, and inside of the foster care systems with the licensed relative is $408. On the right in this green column is 2 of those permanency options I talked about earlier, kinship guardianship and adoption assistance. The green column and the orange column match quite a bit. But what I really want to focus on is not necessarily the orange and the green. It's more once we start looking at 2 and 3 children, right? So outside of the system with 1 child, it's $266. With 2 children, that goes up to $357. So just under $100 increase, which is still a lot. But when we compare it to licensed kinship foster home, they could get $408 for 1 child and $816 for 2 children. So especially when we're talking about taking care of more than 1 child, those financial differences can be a lot. And I do want to put a little asterisk on this chart and saying that these are 2011 numbers, so they've surely changed, but this is just to give us an idea of those differences. So when we're talking about relatives taking care of children, there can be some great benefits for them being in the system. And in fact, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Heidi to talk about supporting those kinship families inside child welfare.
Great, thank you, Emily, I appreciate it. So, you know, as Emily had said, it's not always easy to be a kin caregiver, and so I want to take a moment to kind of acknowledge some of the issues that kin caregivers may struggle with, some of the challenges, but also look at what some of the solutions may be around kinship caregiving. And, you know, honestly, some of these challenges are the same for both foster parents and for kin foster parents. But, you know, there are certain specific challenges that a kin foster parent may face that a non-kin may not. For instance, the feelings of guilt and shame. So what we know from talking to a variety of kin caregivers is that this constantly changing family dynamic and the movement from being grandma to being, you know, caregiver grandma or aunt or uncle, et cetera, brings with it a lot of emotion and a lot of different feelings. Part of it is, you know, I give the example of somebody will come up and ask you as a kinship caregiver, why are you caring for your niece or your grandchild? And with that comes sort of the need or the feeling that you need to explain what happened to the parent and why the parent can't care for the child. It's not that you don't get that question as a non-kin foster parent, but your personal relationship to the parent and sort of how you feel and how you feel it reflects on you is different when you're a foster parent and not a non-kin foster parent. Another thing I like to talk about, because I hear this a lot, is when I'm talking to kin caregivers, they'll talk about sort of how they feel a little isolated and different from their own typical peer group. You know, I talked to one grandma and she said, yeah, all my friends are talking about these great vacations they're taking and their retirement plans, and I'm going to PTA meetings. And she didn't say it begrudgingly. She just said it was sometimes hard to relate to her peers. So on the solution end of the thing, of the scale, we look at peer support groups, you know, and knowing that you as a kin caregiver are not alone, that as you saw those numbers that Emily showed you, there's very large numbers of kin caregivers that are out there. You are not alone. So being able to have peer support groups, have that ability to speak with other kinship caregivers who are going through the same thing, sharing information, and figuring out how to deal with kind of that ever-changing resolution, I think is very important. Okay, I apologize. I think it's a little hard to hear me. I'm going to try to speak up a little bit. So that leads to sort of the next challenge, and that is the changing dynamic in your family. So when you have a child who is living with a parent and then suddenly they're living with somebody else in the family, you now have a different structure and different dynamics among the family. As I said, maybe the aunt is no longer just the aunt. She's the aunt and she's the caregiver. And that puts her in a different relationship, not only to the child, but a different relationship to the birth parents as well, and perhaps to the whole family. We all know that family can be very complicated, even our own. And so when you think about how these family dynamics may change, and we think about things like if the child's living with the maternal side of the family, how do they relate to the paternal side of the family, things like that. On the solution side, what we really advocate for is using some sort of neutral facilitator to do some family team meetings or icebreaker meetings, and to really talk with the family about how they're going to handle this change in dynamic, this changing role definition. And I do want to point out, and Emily pointed it out a little earlier, but the federal government has really come out strong about the use of kin caregivers, and not just about the use of kin caregivers. And you see a link there to an information memorandum that came out from the federal government. But they talked about not only the need to place children with kin, but for children in foster care, whether they're with kin or foster parents, to stay connected to their family. And not only to stay connected to their family, but to work together as a team and to build off of the relationship that can exist between a resource parent. And I use that term broadly when I say resource parent, meaning kin or non-kin foster parent, a resource parent and the birth parents and the relatives and the siblings, to build sort of a support network around the child. So working together and thinking of ways that we can, as a community, kind of surround the child with this support system. The next challenge that we hear about a lot is sort of those myths and assumptions. And I'm sure most of you have heard this expression that the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. So we'll hear people, whether they're professionals or just people in the community, who say, you know, for instance, if grandma and grandpa raised a child who then started using drugs, how do we know that they're not going to have that same problem with the grandchild? And really sort of assuming that, you know, this child has a family, and if the family has gone awry, then how do we know that there are any good relatives out there or safe and appropriate relatives out there? And that's really a myth that we really need to work hard on combating. And we also talk about kind of handling it through culture shift. We call it culture shift. And the culture shift is to not assume that every relative that is involved in that child's life or that's related to that child is inappropriate or not safe because of the actions of the parent. And that perhaps the grandparent was young when they had the child, but now they're older, wiser, have more resources, have a support system. But having these conversations with the families and, frankly, with the professionals around what are some of those assumptions we're making about that relative family, and how can we have conversations like we're having today and trainings like we're having today to try to make that culture shift happen. So another challenge is we hear people say things like, we don't think that their relative can care for the child due to their age or their perceived safety issues. So what can we as a community do to support that relative who's willing to take that child into their home and care for that child by giving them the right supports and services to address their unique needs? For instance, if it's an older caregiver, asking what is that person's support network look like? Who does she rely on if she needs help? You know, are there other relatives that can step forward and help the relative caregiver? Okay, we can move on to the next slide. So the physical and mental health of the caregiver. You saw some statistics about grandparents. We are starting to really get to know more about the actual caregivers and what they look like, the ones who are stepping forward to care for these 2.7 million children. And what we have found is they put the child first. I know that we all think that that's a great thing. I'm not going to disagree. However, sometimes it is at the expense of their own physical and mental health. So making sure that in order to take care for the child, they're not giving up the ability to be healthy themselves so that they can be the best caregiver possible for the child. So that might mean not only are you referring the child for services, but you may be referring the caregivers for supportive services so that they can take good care of themselves. Another solution would be respite care. And we use respite care for non-kin foster parents, but for kin foster parents, respite care could be the use of non-kin foster parents. It could be the use of a different family member. And maybe that's how we make sure that child stays connected. As Emily said, not every child can live with a relative, but we want to make sure while they're in foster care that they stay connected to all their family and relatives, even if those relatives cannot be placement resources. One of the #1 factors of success for a child who ages out of foster care, who becomes 18, 19, 21, leaves foster care, is that they have that support network that was built and maintained for them while they're in foster care, making sure that they stay connected to all of their family. So lack of resources is another challenge. And this really happens a lot with those kin caregivers outside the system, but making sure that the resources that we have are actually kin specific, that they have access to training and education. The foster care system was not built with a kin caregiver in mind, it was built with a foster parent in mind. And although we think the world of foster parents, everything that was designed within the system was really to support the foster parent, although I know at times it doesn't feel that way. But making sure that we are really being in tune with the needs of kin caregivers themselves. So access to accurate information and the fear of systems. I hear that a lot from caregivers, that maybe they're caring for this child without the system involved. They're afraid of stepping forward. They're afraid of asking for help. They're afraid it's a reflection on their inability to care for the child safely and appropriately. They're afraid that if they ask for help, someone will come in, assess them and say, no, you can't care for this child. And ultimately their goal is to make sure they're the ones caring for the child, that the child can stay in their family. They may not have the right information. They may not realize that coming forward to the agency will allow them to access services. Although at times, and I can't say it hasn't happened, the child may need to be removed from the relative. So that fear is kind of justifiable, but what can we do to combat that? We can have well-trained kinship staff and well-trained agency staff who have written materials that explain the various permanency and placement options for living with kin. It is very, very complicated. There are several different ways a child can live with a kinship caregiver inside and outside the system, and making sure that we have materials that are written and easily understood and in several languages so that the caregiver can make good decisions. And the system's complicated, whether it's applying for TANF or SNAP or becoming a foster parent, helping them, holding their hand and helping them navigate the system. This final one here, the unexpected responsibility of caring for children. I think this is probably the biggest difference between, whoops, if we can go back, between non-kin and kin caregivers, is that the kin caregiver did not expect this. The non-kin foster parent, and again, tremendous amount of respect, and we absolutely need those folks. They have stepped forward to say, I want to care for children. I want to help. How can I help? And they've stepped forward to do this. The kinship caregiver often is asked to do this in the middle of the night at the last moment. It's unanticipated. They don't know that they're going to be taking extra children into their home. So making sure we give them what they need to be able to support that placement. Housing is another big issue that we hear from kin caregivers, looking at if they're in senior-only housing and how can they take the child into their home if they're in senior-only housing, if they're in housing that is subsidized housing and they're limited to the number of people in their home. So what can we do to collaborate with the local housing authority to make sure that the kin caregiver who's willing to take that child has the housing they need and the space they need to do that in a legal way? Limited access to legal representation for caregivers. I often say the agency has an attorney sitting next to them, the child has an attorney sitting next to them in court, and the parent has an attorney sitting next to them in court. The person that doesn't is the kinship caregiver most likely, and a lot of times the foster parent. So making sure when they're making all of those decisions with regard to what type of placement is best for my family, that they have the ability to speak to lawyers. So making referrals to legal services and local collaboration. You have Pegasus Legal Services there in New Mexico, which is excellent for kin caregivers. You also have the New Mexico Legal Aid Project, which is working with kin caregivers. You're very fortunate on a national level. We don't have that type of kinship legal advocacy in every state. And finally, and this really is for those caregivers in the system, the foster care licensing system and standards were originally created and built to make sure that we are licensing safe and appropriate home for children to unrelated foster parents. And so things like having too many children in a room if they're siblings and allowing it. Things like grandma sleeping on a pull-out sofa, that's okay, because it's more important that we think about everyone having their own space and safely, but being able to be with that relative. The other piece that we hear a lot is they can like to have training, but also making sure that the training includes things like addressing those family dynamics and addressing some of these challenges that we talked about, only really applying to kin. With regard to the licensing, waiving any of the licensing standards that are really not safety related. For example, having a certain number of children in the home with their siblings or their cousins, and can they share a room? So really being flexible with regard to licensing, but still ultimately making sure the homes are safe and appropriate. So that leads us to the ultimate question: is kin always the best choice? And I like to say yes, but we know that is not always going to be the case in every single family that we meet. What we want to do, and what we're hoping we can really impress upon all of you today, is the need to search for kin throughout the case, preferably at the beginning so that it doesn't disrupt permanency later, but to search for and engage the kin to possibly be a placement choice for this child. And if not a placement choice, at least a supportive resource. But when you're trying to figure out what is the best place for this child, with a lot of different perspectives. So what does the parent want? What does the child want? What does the kinship caregiver want? What does the caseworker or the social service agency want? And trying to see if we can take a look at all those different perspectives and take them into account when deciding what is the best placement for the child. In addition to that, we have competing interests as well. The law says, and we know, we should keep siblings together. We know that kin first is the best placement for a child when possible. School. The law tells us the child should try to stay in their school of origin, because we know that it's difficult when a child has to change schools. For a lot of these children, that's their main source of stability, their friends, their teachers, things that they know in the school. If they're going to place them with a kin or a foster parent and it requires a change in school, how to weigh that as a competing interest. Can the home meet the special needs of the child? Just because they're a kin relative doesn't mean that they have the training and what they need in the home to meet the special needs of the child. But what can we as a system do to help them get there and give them the services so that they can be trained? And finally, proximity to parents is another really important one. We know that ultimately in every one of these cases, the goal starts and should be safe reunification with the parents. And so we have to make sure that the placement choice will foster that relationship between the foster parent or the kin foster parent and the parent, and if it's close enough to allow the parent to maintain that relationship. But ultimately, each case has to be assessed on an individual basis, and ultimately the role of the court. They will actually decide which is the best placement. Push comes to shove, but we hope that it won't come to that there can be an agreement with regard to what the best placement for the child may be. Okay, so now we're gonna kind of turn from placement and move over to permanency, kinship guardianship assistance. So kinship guardianship assistance is a program that is available for relatives to assume kinship guardianship for children exiting the foster care system. So as of 2008, under the Fostering Connections to Success and Increasing Adoptions Act, the federal government has allowed the use of federal funds for eligible children who leave foster care for legal guardianship with a relative. And we'll get to how New Mexico defines relative for this purpose in a moment. And we were thrilled to see that this was being allowed under 2008 with federal funds. Prior to 2008, approximately 37 states had what was called a waiver to have a similar program, and New Mexico was one of those states. So this is really not a new concept to New Mexico, but since the passage of this act in 2008 and New Mexico's adoption of this provision, we're hoping that New Mexico will really start to utilize this option for relatives. It's an excellent option if you've got a relative who says, look, I appreciate your help and support by being a foster parent and everything I got from being part of the system to care for this child. However, I'm at the point now where I know that I no longer need the services of the agency, but I want to care for this child permanently. So what this guardianship assistance program allows them to do is it allows the agency to close the case safely and give guardianship to the relative with a subsidy, very similar to the adoption assistance subsidy. And it can only be done if you know that all efforts towards reunification have failed and is no longer a viable option, and adoption is no longer a viable option. And so what we do is we have a lot of relatives who say, look, I'm grandma, I want to stay grandma, or I'm aunt or uncle, and I want to stay the aunt or uncle, but I will care for this child permanently. I just don't want to change that legal relationship. I don't want to terminate the parent's rights, and I don't want to legally become the parent. I want to stay grandma. And so guardianship assistance is an excellent option for them. It also allows them to continue with Medicaid, and if they change to a different state, they're allowed to take the guardianship subsidy with them. If they decide later they want to adopt the child and the child qualifies, they can get an adoption assistance subsidy as well. So what does New Mexico's kinship guardianship look like? Recently, New Mexico passed a new law, the Kinship Guardianship Act, which spelled out the eligibility criteria for this guardianship assistance. The child has to have been removed from his or her parents, and or under a voluntary placement agreement. So you have to be formally in the foster care system. As I said, adoption and reunification have to be determined to no longer be the appropriate permanency options for the child. The child has to demonstrate a strong attachment to the prospective guardian. And similarly, the kinship guardian must have a strong commitment to care permanently for the child. So how does New Mexico define kin guardian? They say it can be a relative of the child, a godparent, a member of the child's tribe or clan, or an adult with whom the child has a significant bond. And I will also take that a step further, talking about a child who has had a relationship with a significant adult prior to their entry into the foster care system. So the child must be Title IV eligible and live with that kinship foster parent, who has to be fully licensed, for 6 consecutive months prior to granting the guardianship. If the child is 14 or older, they have to be consulted. And if you have one sibling who doesn't meet this eligibility criteria, but another sibling does, they can be part of the kinship guardianship assistance agreement at the same time. So, additional provisions. It's very important to understand that every kinship guardian will enter into what's called a guardianship assistance agreement, which stipulates how much they will be getting every month and what their responsibilities are to the child. That agreement must be signed and in place before the court grants legal guardianship. Additionally, and this was under federal law, the kinship guardian is allowed to seek reimbursement for up to $2,000 per child for non-recurring expenses. And that typically is legal fees, because we feel, and the federal government felt, that it's very important that they consult an attorney and make sure they have everything they need in that order granting guardianship. Because as I said, once that order is granted, the case is closed. There are no more court hearings. There are no more caseworkers involved. Guardianship is pretty much granted to the relative unless the parent at a later date petitions the court and asks for the child back and shows that there has been a change in circumstances. Another factor, which I think is an excellent part of the kinship guardianship law, is that the guardian may name a successor guardian in their assistance agreement to care for the child should they pass away or become incapacitated and no longer be able to care for the child. By naming that successor guardian, if something were to happen to the kinship guardian, the successor guardian can come into court, be able to have the child placed in their home, and still receive those guardianship assistance payments. And I will tell you, the successor guardian does not need to be a relative when named, and they do not need to be licensed as a foster parent. However, before the child's placed into the home, all the background checks and everything will be done prior to placing the child in the home and allowing the guardianship assistance payments to transfer. So we have to weigh the options. And as I said, this is where it really helps to talk to an attorney for choosing the right permanency goal. It's got to be decided on a case-by-case basis. Kinship guardianship might be great for one family. Adoption might be better for another family. So really making those decisions are tough, and you want to engage all of the stakeholders in that decision. The parents, the children, the caregivers, the agency, everybody, you know, in the ideal world has an agreement as to what is best for the child, because ultimately that is the question. What is going to be best for the child? Now, for the caregiver, in order to make this decision, they really need all of the information. An informed decision is important from the beginning. And we want to make sure that we have looked at what we call the permanency hierarchy, making sure that all efforts were made for reunification as the first goal. But then we get to look at all the other little pieces of it. When you're comparing guardianship versus adoption, looking at inheritance, education assistance, and kind of weighing all those factors. And Anna's going to talk a little bit more about that. But ultimately, we need to think about what is best for this individual child when we're deciding on a permanency goal. I think I will be turning this over to my colleague, Anna.
Thank you so much, Heidi. As we've heard, there's a lot of research, there's a lot of effort nationally and state to place children with relatives, and much of this is reflected in federal law. So about 40 plus years ago, the landmark gold standard of child welfare law, the Indian Child Welfare Act, was enacted. And it really stresses the importance of placing children with tribe, with culture, with community. About 20 years later, that preference was extended to all children. So children throughout the United States, if they're removed from their parents, really preferring that they be placed with family if at all possible. And every state in the country has enacted around the same time and has now a preference for placing children with relatives. Some states have stronger preferences than others, but they all do that. This is not unique to New Mexico. It's really a best practice. You saw it in the research that Emily went over. Of course, as Heidi pointed out, kin is not always possible. It's not always possible to place with kin, and it's not always the best choice. And that's why we value so much and have to have the non-related resource families available. After that preference, we've just seen building on it really, and building on the supports available to kin and the importance of kin. And so 10 years later, the Fostering Connections Act was enacted. And that's the act that Heidi just talked about, because that guardianship assistance comes out of that federal law. And it basically says, New Mexico, you can use your federal money, your federal child welfare money for these guardianship assistance programs if you took the option, which New Mexico took the step and did. Not all states have that option, most do. We're hoping that all will take it because it's an important permanency vehicle for many children who are placed with kin, and adoption isn't appropriate for them, and neither is going back to their parents. So that law also did a number of things, emphasizing that priority with relatives and how important relatives are in general, by requiring that all adult relatives be identified and notified when a child's removed from their parents. So really letting them know about it and step up if they're able to. And if they're not able to be the placement resource, really that importance about keeping them engaged as a resource to the non-kin, and having them in the child's life, even if they can't be the placement. Then a few years later, the Preventing Sex Trafficking and Strengthening Families Act built on foster connections and said that the piece about successor guardians, and said that assistance could continue to the successor guardian. And then finally, a couple of years ago, 2 years ago, the Family First Prevention Services Act, which is really a pivotal act that for the first time in history allows federal child welfare money to be used for keeping children out of foster care. So really for preventing their entry. And this 4E money, which is what it's called, it's just a title of a Social Security Act, but that's the federal child welfare money. And now it can be used to prevent children's entry into care. And how does it do that? Well, it can provide mental health support, substance use prevention, all kinds of things like that to what we call the kinship triad. So kinship caregivers, parents, and children, to really try to build up that family, whether or not the child's living with the relative or the parent, and try to prevent that child from having to enter foster care, either with the relative or with a non-kin relative. So the child welfare system is evolving, and this is kind of the first piece of it, and really trying to emphasize building up families. In addition, the Fostering Connections Act, the Family First Act, does some reforms around foster care licensing. So like Heidi talked about, that's a big challenge for kin and non-kin. These state licensing standards that really had weren't common sense, didn't have much to do with safety of the child, or at least didn't have everything to do with safety of the child, which is what it should be about, and had a lot of things, standards in there around the country about that were based out of litigation, or that were based out of kind of the middle-class ideal of a Disneyland vacation in a beautiful home, as opposed to really what was safe and best for that child. Really kind of a lot of bias was in it, and a lot of these state standards. So the Fed said, we're going to create a national model that you can compare your state standards against, because states and tribes have so much flexibility in this area in creating their own standards. So there are 50 plus sets of licensing standards around the country. And so they created a national model based on a model that we at ADA Generations United had created. So really trying to break down a lot of those barriers. In addition, for the first time, all states and tribes, anybody operating one of these top federal child welfare agencies around the country, what we call Title 4E agencies, can get funding for kinship navigator programs. And kinship navigator programs have been around for about 20 years in certain jurisdictions. They have not been nationwide, but they have been so useful and where they have been implemented because they connect caregivers and children and kinship families to resources and services. So really, because these families have to navigate so many systems, especially those outside the system, outside the child welfare system. So they have to navigate TANF, they have to navigate education, housing, just an array. And so the idea behind these programs is there's someone there to walk them through and how to get access to these services and supports. And Family First allows for federal reimbursement for those programs up to 50%. It is not capped. It's new federal money. It's considered an entitlement, so it's all good news. And then finally, in the group settings, really emphasizing the importance of family throughout that process. So if the child needs to go to residential care or group care, the family should be consulted. They should be part of the decision-making process. They should be part of the child's life while they're in group care, and then they get post-discharge services just like the child, so that they can step down to another placement with hopefully a relative or in a non-kin foster home, or even better, going back to their parents. So drilling a little more down on those licensing standards, because we know that you have some new ones in New Mexico, and we want to applaud you for those new licensing standards because they really were based on best practices, promising practices, the national models, both sets of them, and really what we know about breaking down barriers. Not just for kin, because the same set of licensing standards apply to kin as non-kin. And there were just standards in there, like there were all around the country, that didn't make sense. Things like every foster parent, whether kin or non-kin, had to own a vehicle. Well, now those foster parents can rely on public transportation if it makes sense. You know, if you live in the middle of the city and a car is not cheap and not easy to park, et cetera, and you've got a lot of access to buses and taxis, et cetera, then that's fine. Or if you live in a suburb and you have access, that's fine. Or the rural and you have access, that's fine. Also, the emphasis, like Heidi talked a little bit about, sleeping spaces rather than bedrooms. So it doesn't, New Mexico doesn't get into, you have to have certain amount of square footage, you have to have X number of bedrooms. No, there's flexibility there, there's common sense there. Again, not that you don't have to be spectacularly wealthy to take in more children and have a bedroom for each kid, for each child. Also, and one of the ones I really think are important is that prior to these reforms this year, the standards were written that foster family, whether related or not, had to have enough wealth to take on a child without relying on that foster care maintenance payment. That's the way that it was written. And now it's very clearly written that no, you've got to be financially stable as a family, as an entity, as a person, before you take on a foster child, whether related or not. But you could use and rely on that foster care maintenance payment for that child and meet that child's needs. Because, I mean, who among us could take care of another child without more income, right? I mean, it's just not very feasible. So we applaud New Mexico. All of these challenges that I've talked about and that Emily's talked about are really heightened now in the time of COVID-19, as they are for all of us, but we're really seeing the needs very clearly with the kinship families. But before I start talking about it, we really want to hear from you and what you're seeing. So if you are a kinship caregiver, answer this as yourself. If you are a non-kin resource parent, answer this for yourself. But if you're CYFD and staff, and I see there are a lot on this webinar today, please answer this not as yourself personally, because we know you too are facing challenges, but answer it as in terms of the families that you're working with. So I have just launched the poll. I hope you can see it. Maybe not, just a moment. I am new to this. Here we go. Can you all see that, I hope?
Yes.
Great.
Anna, while people are doing the poll, we have heard that you're cutting out a little in and out. Your sound is echoing a bit.
Oh, no.
And I'm not sure there's anything you can do, but I don't know if there's any adjustments that you can make, but.
Not really.
Okay, that's what I thought.
I will try to speak up at least. I apologize. I don't usually have that problem. Okay, well, thank you. You're all participating in this poll, and we're seeing some challenges across the board. Food, legal assistance. The big one, which is elevated a lot, is the problems with schooling and working from home, which we're all feeling very difficult times. And then another one, which we've seen across all three sets of webinars, is the visitation issue and how you manage that. So thank you for, yes.
Sorry, we have a question. Can you choose more than one option? And I don't recall, to be honest.
Yes, you can, or should be able to, unless the technology is not allowing it.
Yeah, it looks like people are saying you can only choose one. So we apologize if you can only choose one. That was not our intention, of course.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, we even wrote, please check all that apply. So sorry about that. All right, well, I'm going to end it now, but I hope you all see the results and that visitation, lost jobs, schooling, working from home. Those are really the ones that are being elevated the most. I will share it right now, and hopefully you can see it there. And you will see that the schooling and working from home issue is huge, and it's huge for all of us.
Okay. They also said for audio, they switched to their phone and it was better. So if there's anybody that can switch to their phone from their computer audio, apparently that's better.
Thank you, Heidi.
Sure.
So we appreciate you all participating in that poll and elevating a lot of the concerns that frankly, a lot of us are having, whether foster parents or not. But what's unique about kinship families is that many of them are 60 and older, or they're immunocompromised, which makes them different than other birth parents or resource parents, because a vast number are over age 60, they're retired, they have challenges that are unique to that age group, and also many of them are immunocompromised, there's a big word. In addition to those challenges, the challenges around kinship caregiving is that for non-kin, right, you're licensed and it goes through a process, and then you're ready to take on a child, you can plan for it, you can expect it. But with the non-kin, that whole situation is put in reverse. So they get licensed after they get the child. So they may not be ready to take the child, right? And they may not have they won't have the financial support that licensed foster parents have, because they have to go through a process to become licensed, and there is typically not financial assistance available, or it's less during that provisional licensing period. So there's the age element, there's the immunocompromised element, there's this, reverse licensing procedure, and then for those kin outside the system, like Emily was pointing out, the only thing that's usually available to financially assist them on an ongoing basis is that temporary assistance for needy families, which is much smaller than foster care maintenance payments. So all of that aggravates their challenges in these days of COVID-19. In addition to that, if they're outside the system and the child welfare system doesn't have legal custody, and the relative doesn't have legal custody, the parent still has legal custody, but maybe in and out of the picture, how does the relative consent to services for those child, get services for those child? They have no legal authorities. So then there's a whole other set of issues around legal access and access to all the benefits and the rest of it without that relationship. So kinship families have unique challenges. What we're hearing from them in New Mexico and around the country is they can't shop safely. A lot of these stores are having 8 hours, special hours early in the morning for 60 plus and folks with disabilities, but it's usually says, you can't bring any gas, no gas. Okay, well, what if you're grandma and you've got a 4-year-old granddaughter and you can't leave her home? So what do? Well, you have to shop with everybody else. So there goes that safety protection of shopping at the quieter time. You can't protect yourself from the children because you're raising them, so like older grandparents are kind of not having contact with their children with their grandchildren right now. These folks don't have that luxury. They have to have contact. The financial assistance piece is huge because, like I said, a lot of them are older and a lot of them rely on their retirement savings to care for these children, to meet the needs of these children. And those savings are plummeting right now with the stock market as it is. So real concerns around there that's somewhat unique. The technology and virtual support, you know, like we talked about, we all have these challenges, all of us. But they're greater, you know, when you're an older caregiver, when you're trying to navigate safety care, taking care of that child, but really having to help them log on and help them access the internet, help them pay for it. So really big concerns around that we're seeing around the country. And then of course the child welfare issues, which we've heard on the other webinars and we've heard from around the country, particularly in regards to visitation. How do you manage that visitation with parents, with other family members safely? And I know in New Mexico, that the Supreme Court has said that virtual visitation is all right in certain instances, and so is the department. But of course, navigating that and making sure it's done well. And what we always tell the families we work with is, you know, try to document everything, try to do it virtually, try to make sure, you know, that you're doing everything you can, but keep yourself safe. That is important. And work with the department as well. The home visits, all the challenges to becoming licensed now because things are delayed. And then planning for those children, because like I said, a lot of the relatives, especially those outside the system, have no legal relationship with children. The parent may or may not be in the picture. So how does that person plan for that child in the event they die, or the event the caregiver dies or becomes disabled? What happens to that child? So really a lot of issues and a lot of challenges that the COVID-19 crisis is highlighting and heightening. What's New Mexico doing to help the kinship caregivers? Well, quite a few things, and really should be applauded. There's a page on the website devoted to COVID-19. You'll see a link there on the CYFD website. And New Mexico was recently approved for more food stamps or SNAP resources from the U.S. Department of Agriculture, which is great that New Mexico took that step and applied for that, because all these things, they take a lot of paperwork and a lot of effort to get the money down from the feds sometimes, and to get the flexibility that the feds are trying to provide. So kudos to New Mexico, and I'm sure they'll be rolling that out. There's also on that website resources to get free meals for children and senior food, and then that $106.75 more per child per month in foster care maintenance payments that the department is providing. That is we have not heard that in every state, so really hats off. And we heard on the last webinar that you should have gotten those checks for April, that additional money for April, and you will be getting it for May, and then they'll see going forward. And if I misspoke there, Anna Marie, just correct me at any point. But I believe that's what I understood, which is great. There's also in that letter there that's linked a little more guidance around home visits and visitations, so you can refer to that letter. Other resources that Mexico is providing around childcare, educational tools, and mental health supports, including a number that you can call. You don't have to be in crisis to call that number, so, or at least in, emergency crisis. Nationally, we're also trying to respond to this crisis in every way possible. The federal government is being more flexible these days, and more money is coming down from Congress. So the biggest thing that happened most recently was just a week ago, and the Federal Child Welfare Agency, the Children's Bureau that oversees all the federal money that goes down to the states for child welfare, has now said that states and tribes, you can use your federal child welfare money to pay for foster care maintenance payment rates during that provisional licensing period, which is huge. They've never allowed this before. So states can use that federal money to pay maintenance payments during that time, which will make a big difference for kinship families. New Mexico will have to go through a process to be able to do that, and the instructions are on that linked program instruction there. All these things that have underlines on them have internet links. So all you do is click on them when you get the slides, and you will, if you haven't gotten the slide yet, you will get them after this presentation. There are a lot of tools at gu.org and at grandfamilies.org. Each website has COVID-19 pages, which you'll see linked there. They have on them a guide to getting the stimulus payment, a summary of that $2 trillion CARES Act and how it impacts kinship families, and a leave behind advocacy tool for letting local decision makers know how to access that CARES money and to make sure and remember kinship families as part of the population that they serve. There are ongoing federal advocacy efforts to getting additional funds for kinship navigator programs, to get additional funds for direct goods and services for kinship navigator programs, and for temporary assistance for needy families. So a lot of work being done. Know that there are a lot of efforts being made. And then these last two tools are around education and foster care, and those are links as well. So we have a number of other resources that we'd like to share with you today, including the fact that New Mexico has started a kinship navigator program. They have a website now. It's linked here. There's a phone line. They're going to start rolling this out as a pilot in relative success centers. So New Mexico is well on its way. Other resources that grandfamilies.org that all of us have been referencing today, and that's a one-stop kinship shop, we like to say, one-stop kinship stop, with as many resources as we can pull together around an array of topic areas. And on that website are housed state fact sheets for each state in the country, including New Mexico. And when you download this fact sheet, you'll see that it's got contact information for kinship-specific programs like Pegasus that Heidi referenced, and in addition to kind of an array of phone numbers and contact for federal benefits that are available in New Mexico. So hopefully that resource will be useful. We've also created a chart comparing adoption with guardianship for children in kinship foster care. So really looking at the differences on a big, broad brush national basis. And this should help all caregivers and staff, we hope. It gives you the legal differences, the financial implications going through childhood. So we're also going to create a template for each state based on this national template, which will help some more state-specific information, but this should be useful on a big, broad brush stroke basis. We've also done a series of briefs with Casey Family Programs and Children's Defense Fund, the ABA, and Generations United around the Family First Act, including this resource, which is really directed at the families themselves, and in terms of advocating for implementation of that law in your communities. Finally, there is a new Supporting Grandparents Raising Grandchildren Council. And the title's unfortunate, but it encompasses other relatives, victim kin, and the like. So it's more global. And it has met in person once now and another time virtually. And really the idea here is to coordinate federal responses, resources, because like I said, kinship care is in so many different systems and so many different silos that really trying to get them to work together, which is something we wanted to do for a long time. And a really important thing is they are serving as a national model to states because there is the majority of the membership have a lived experience, or at least a good chunk of them. They're mostly caregivers. They mostly walk in your shoes and really get the issues. So that will result in a report to Congress and hopefully more coordination in the future. There are a number of national organizations working on all the issues that we've talked about today. I'll elevate the Children's Defense Fund because they do a lot for kin and non-kin. So a lot of resources out there. And it has been a pleasure talking with you all today. Know that we're available for questions now and available for questions after. You're welcome to email us. And I'm going to turn it over to Janet Garcia, who is a strategic consultant for Casey Family Programs in New Mexico. She works very closely with the state and with all the stakeholders in New Mexico to facilitate the question period. So please type them in the boxes and we'll do our best to address them. Thank you so much. Janet?
Yes, trying to get off mute here. First of all, thank you, Anna and Heidi and Emily for a great presentation today, and Acting Director Luna for your introduction of why it's so important that we're focused on kin. And thank you for all who attended. We had a great group, a great number of attendees in this effort. I haven't seen a lot of questions in the chat. Feel free to put anything in there that you would like some more information on from our trainers. There were a couple of questions that were submitted prior to the training. So I'll start there while we see if there's other questions currently. One of the questions had to do with if you're an adoptive parent, the balance between building that relationship with your adopted child and keeping them connected to kin. So I'm not sure, was it Anna who answered that in the last training? Whoever, if you can maybe address that a little bit, that keeping a link to biofamily even when its placement with them isn't possible and there's an adoption.
Well, there is new guidance out that I believe all of us talked about, at least in passing. And it came out in late April, and it's linked in various parts of the presentation that came out from the federal government. And it really does have some useful tips about how we really should all look at each other as a resource. So non-kin, kin should look at the birth parents as a resource, as kind of mutually building up that mutual relationship. So the foster parents are serving as a resource to the birth parents while they're trying to reunify. And then once reunification happens, the birth parents should look on you all as a resource and really maintain that connection and that loving relationship with the child and keep them in the life. And the same goes with adoption. We know that children benefit from really maintaining all those loving relationships that they've had. So Heidi, would you like to add anything to that?
Yeah, the only thing I want to add is, in the ideal world, you have kept the child connected as a foster parent with their family throughout their stay with you prior to an adoption. So one would hope that you will have established good relationships with those relatives such that you would allow them to continue, maintaining that connection with the child. There are, open adoption laws that allow for it, but even without the laws, hopefully your relationship is one between yourself as an adoptive resource and the biological family that you feel comfortable continuing that relationship. But ultimately, without a court order, it really is up to the adoptive parent to maintain those, to allow those connections.
Thank you. And there's a great question in the chat about a grandma taking care of grandchildren and maintaining a bond with birth children at the same time, perhaps the parents of the children that are in care. And I know, Heidi, I believe you dealt with that. You talked about that a bit when you talked about the challenges of kinship foster care. Anything else, anything more to say on kind of navigating those sometimes very complicated relationships?
There is an excellent video series by a national expert, Dr. Joseph Crumbly, and it is posted on grandfamilies.org in our latest news banner. And he does a really nice job of talking about how to work with kin caregivers. And I think it's really great for kin caregivers to look at and sort of acknowledging those very issues. But honestly, if it's a problematic relationship, or even if you just want to strengthen the relationship, I never think it's a bad idea to bring in a third neutral party, whether it's a family therapist, or if the caseworker is comfortable enough, or family group decision making. But sometimes you just need that neutral person in the room to kind of help get over those rough patches that happen, because they're just those shifting dynamics. That's going to happen.
I just put his full name and the link in the chat box, because Dr. Crumbly is a great resource for those kinds dealing with all those complicated family dynamics.
Thank you.
I'm just reading what's in the chat. Yeah, and I think it's kind of continuing on that, keeping the communication open when there's complicated relationships and
Yeah, and I think ultimately everybody is trying to do what's best for the child. So, even if you may not always agree with the parent, or you may not always agree with a different member of the family, trying to remember it's really about what the child needs and keeping them connected. And that's really easy for me to sit here and say that, not always so easy to do.
Yeah, and I think you all referenced in the presentation that things change and people change, and that keeping the door open to a better relationship later can often pay fruit in the long run. So thank you very much. Yeah, questions about the PowerPoint will be coming out. Another question, and this may be a reference to another resource, but best practices around preventing the spread of infection when returning to face-to-face visits. Any recommendations, comments on that topic?
We have Generations United has a resource that we developed, which really just cites, CDC and other information out there, but about, all those good habits to follow when we resume mixing in society here. But they are bigger concerns for kinship families in general because of those age and those immunocompromised issues. So, do it with all those best practices in mind, but, do it only if you feel safe, and really, document attempts to do video conferencing and phone, and work with the agency and the courts and making them know what the health concerns are and health issues are. But, you can always do things like meeting outside, that alleviates some of the risk. But it's a complicated situation. It is, but do take care of yourselves as well. And that's important.
Director Luna, did you have anything to add on that topic?
Yes, I think that we've been providing a guide to visits for our staff, and we'll make sure we get that out to our foster parents when we resume visits. There's really, screening, maintaining social distance, ensuring that anyone who is in that visit hasn't had COVID, been in contact, or has any of the symptoms. So we'll get that out.
Thank you. Yeah, and there's a comment in the chat about kinship caregivers outside of the system, not getting as much as children in the system or as providers in the system. And kind of that being a reason that kids can come into care. Any comments about that?
It's absolutely our concern as well. And honestly, it should be everyone's concern, because these families outside the system need to be supported better. I mean, the children should have their needs met. And if they're not, they're going to enter the foster care system, and there's going to be a national reckoning in terms of taxpayer money, because we estimate at Generations United that even if half those kids that are outside the system with relatives were to enter foster care, it's going to cost taxpayers $4 billion more per year. So there's a significant cost savings that kinship families are providing outside the system, but we need to step up and make sure that there's equity there and there's support for those children and families, because they really are doing an amazing service. So their efforts made all the time, and we'll keep trying to get temporary assistance for needy families increased, keep trying to get kinship navigator programs out there, keep trying to get those supports for the families outside the system.
Yeah, and there's a lot of advocacy around that very issue. And I just want to give a shout out to Generations United, because they are just front and center with the federal government to show about the inequity. So we could not agree with you more. It shouldn't be this way.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I don't see any other questions.
There's one question. It looks like that they're having problem with the survey. So I don't know if
Right.
if there's any guidance that we can give you on that one. Sandra. Yeah.
Right, Heidi, I sent Daniel my email address so he can directly connect with me. If there's anybody else who's having issues, please, I'll go ahead and type in my email address, and then we'll work on that. We'll figure it out.
Thank you, Sandra.
Thank you. And there's another question about how will we know we're getting credit for the meeting? And that there will be certificates following when the evaluations come in. Is that correct, Sandra?
Yes, it is. So I'll go ahead, the survey, the link to the survey, the address is up there on the screen. I'll go ahead and type it again into the chat box. But please, when you fill out the survey, then you'll get your certificate of attendance.
And are
Okay.
they being mailed to the home?
I think they will be emailed, is my understanding, but I'll confirm that.
Okay, is there any other final words?
Thank you for having us. Thank you for all you're doing for the families. And let's all just try to stay safe and as sane as we can.
Words to live by.
Likewise. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks,
Thank
everybody.
you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.